All right, fam. Stream should be starting any second now. I think it already started, which is lit. All right, cool. So, today I wanted to really touch on JavaScript, which is the next step in all of our web dev journeys. You can't really get anywhere past HTML and CSS without using some JavaScript. And so, just to recap, right? So far, we've been able to start our own web pages building with HTML and CSS. Give me a thumbs up if you've already built your first web page with HTML and CSS. I know a good amount of y'all have. Folks were sending me love. They were talking about, wow, this is my first site. And, I'm grateful that I could build this. Like, shout outs to y'all because, using what you know now, that's literally all you need to know when it comes to building out HTML and CSS based sites, right? Everything else is just experimentation, figuring out like what's the right way to add some styles or add some elements to your page to get the effect that you're looking for. So congratulations on making it to this point in the course and in just your journey on web dev. Um, there's clearly, as y'all probably can tell, like a lot more depth to HTML and CSS that you can get through, but that's the great entry point for where you need to be with relationship to, building sites out. Mostly because every time we've built a site so far, right, they've been kind of static. And let me show you what I mean by that, right? So take, for instance, this little fan club site that I built as an example, right? So this is my little random fan club site. You see nice little text. I got an image in there. And toward the bottom, I have like a little contact form. Not much is going on with that yet. And then each page subsequently is also kind of just text and information that just kind of sits on the page. There aren't really any interactions, right? There's not much going on in the page to make, not much changes as the user does anything or walks through their journey, right? It's what we might call static, right? And typically a lot of our web pages that just use HTML and CSS are going to be this way. Now, one caveat is CSS is fairly powerful in allowing for us to add certain effects, right? Like, hey, maybe with CSS, I can like make when I hover over something, it changes colors and things like that. And those things are very helpful for building some of that interactivity. But if you think about it, the data on the site, the HTML and the CSS doesn't really change. It kind of stays static, right? So you're going to hear that term a lot when it comes to regular HTML and CSS based sites, that they're called static sites because of the fact that none of the data related to those sites are changing despite maybe some, they're not really changing, right? Like just like the HTML is the same, the CSS is the same, but the CSS might allow for some of that visual interactivity. So think about static meaning like the files itself isn't really changing at all. Now, when you think about like the sites that we use day to day though, like, you compare a site like this to a site like Reddit or Twitter or any of the major apps that we use, right? There's a big difference in terms of how those sites work with a static site like this, right? On those sites, things change pretty dynamically, right? At one point, you have you create a new post, right? And once you create a new post, you see that post come back on the feed somewhere, or somebody uploaded something, and now you see that image or that video coming across your particular feed, right? In those sites, a lot of times you can see dynamic data, like data is changing dynamically on those sites, right? As you start interacting, typing on stuff, you see things, you leave comments, right? We are able to change what we actually see on the site at any given point in time, most of the time with these applications. Now, that's what we call a dynamic site. And the reality is the step between a static site and a dynamic site really is the introduction of JavaScript to make those sites more dynamic and interactive. So a lot of what we're going to do today is play around with this static site and try to make it a little bit more dynamic and just in lightweight ways, because at the same time, I want to use it as an opportunity to introduce y'all to JavaScript. So if that makes sense and y'all ready to rock with me, just give me a thumbs up. You know what I'm saying? I'm a check for understanding type dude. I don't want to do some stuff if y'all ain't here making and it don't make no sense what we try to accomplish. So cool. I see a couple folks. Thank y'all so much. I appreciate your time and your patience and your energy. All right, bet. So how are we going to do this? Well, first of all, we got to talk a little bit about JavaScript and what it is, how it works, and where are we going to make it happen. And then we got to put some JavaScript in to add some extra layers of complexity to our little fan club site to make it just feel a little bit more like, you know, hey, it's doing something for us, right? So to do that first, let's just take a pause on the changes specifically to the site and talk a little bit more about JavaScript and what we're hoping to do with it. So just give me 1 second. I want to share actually a really important um, graphic with y'all that will hopefully help make sense of what is it that we're going to be able to use JavaScript for. And I love the W3 schools because they really do a great job of making that information pretty accessible. So right now, I just want to share that with y'all. So if we go to the W3 schools, first of all, shout out to W3 schools because they have an entirely free JavaScript tutorial for anyone that's interested in learning a little bit more about JavaScript, from how to write it to where does it get written and all of those things. But one of the resources outside of like all of the tutorial that talk about everything from the JavaScript syntax and how to write variables and all of those things, they have a really dope section on what we call the HTML DOM. And this is a really important concept for all web developers to know, right? It's one of those concepts that comes up on interviews pretty constantly, right? They're going to ask you about the DOM. What is the DOM, right? And when they ask you about it, you got to remember that the DOM is an acronym, right? DOM is an acronym for Document Object Model, right? The document object model is a very important concept when it comes to how JavaScript works with our web apps and websites to make it so that we can dynamically use JavaScript to make our sites dynamic, basically, right? So what is the document object model and how does it work? Well, the document object model, let's break that down into its core components. The first word there is document, right? And when you think about a document, maybe you think about like the HTML document that we were creating, but maybe you don't, right? But that document word right there is referring to the HTML document that we are working with in our website. So remember that all HTML is built off of HTML documents. So if I actually share my VS Code screen, right, and we take a look at this index.html for the, and we take a look at this, wait 1 second, my bad fam, sorry about that. I wanna do right by y'all, but I gotta share the right thing. Okay, sorry. If we take a look at this document, right, this HTML document, remember all HTML is structured as documents, right? We start off by basically, you know, leaving a declaration that, hey, this whole file is going to be an HTML file, but that we end up creating an HTML tag that represents what we call the HTML document. So every time you work with HTML, you want to think about it like you're creating documents, and those documents have the ability to have elements on them. Those elements have the ability, like, you know, like you can see, here's all of the elements that I have in my document right now, right? I have a head and a body. The head has some of the metadata and some links to connect my HTML to my CSS file, but also my body has all of the visual elements that I'm using in order to show the elements of this particular website that y'all were seeing earlier today. So HTML is all about documents, right? And you use the HTML to structure those documents with certain elements. We use elements for metadata related things like in the head. We also use elements for visual things in the body. And the body is where you'll see you spend a lot of time creating all of the elements that you visually want to show on your site. So not only does the document allow for us to create these elements, right? It allows us to tell those elements about information about themselves, right? We can give those elements, like if you look here at the image, we can give those elements certain attributes, right? And attributes are the little properties that we're able to pass into an element to give it some information about itself. Some of those attributes are required, like for an image, you need to pass a source attribute if you want your image to show up. But then some of those attributes are a little bit less, are not necessarily as required, like the ID or the class attributes, which we can use to essentially tag certain elements with a particular ID, or identifier, I should say. that we can use to reference that element later, especially with relationship to our CSS. So when it comes to the HTML document, right, the HTML document is responsible for defining the elements, providing attributes for those particular elements, and then creating connections to other files and referencing different files to make it so that we show the elements and interact with the elements in the right way. The document part, though, about HTML is one of the more important pieces here, because with that document comes the ability for us to use the document object model, to go back to what I was talking about here. So when we talk about the document object model, we're talking firstly about an HTML document, any HTML document. Second word here is object, right? And object is an interesting word because, you know, for folks who have never spent a time in computer science class or ever heard that word in a computer science context, yeah, you know, what do you think about an object? You think about like these things that like you can interact with, right? Well, in a computer science context, an object is almost like a piece of data that you can interact with in a similar regard, right? We use objects to store data, and we can interact with that object and its data in our programs. Now, objects have a very special meaning when it comes to JavaScript, because in JavaScript, a lot of data, if not all data, to not go too deep real fast, all data in JavaScript is structured and stored as objects. And objects, really, like I just said, are just kind of interactable pieces of data, for lack of better words. And what makes this interesting is that what the document object model is doing, right? The model part is basically saying, hey, I'm going to take this document and I'm going to model it as an object. Meaning, if we try to break that down into like simple, like what is it doing for us, Cam? Get to the point. We're taking an HTML document and breaking it up into its core elements and objects, and core elements, and we can reference those elements as data within an object. So what the document object model does is it allows for us to reference an entire HTML document as if it was just an object of data. And we can see the different parts of that document as data that we can interact with. So what does that mean in theory, right? What does that real mean, like in kind of like practical things, right? So let's say, for instance, we have this HTML document, right? And the HTML document, like any HTML, it starts as a document with a root element that is the HTML tag, kind of like how our document here starts with the HTML as the root element as well, right? So then you can see that in this particular HTML document, this one right here that we're looking at on the W3 schools, we have a head and a body, right? And give me a thumbs up. Y'all remember, like I said, that the head and the body are always going to be like useful elements that we're going to see in any HTML document, right? So that makes sense, right? So we have an HTML document. Inside we have a head, and inside we have a body. I appreciate y'all with the thumbs up. Thank you so much. So the head and the body, right? Remember, those can each have their own elements underneath them, right? So the head might have like a title element, and the body might have like an anchor or an H1, like a heading or something, right? So those are just representing how each of these elements, the head and the body, might have elements underneath them. And if we look closely, you can see how next to the title or underneath the title is a text that says my title. Or next to the anchor, we see an attribute for the href, right? And underneath that anchor, we see the text for my link. Or in the element for the H1, we see the text, my header. Remember that within HTML, all of the elements, majority of the elements we use are nest other pieces of data inside of them, right? So for instance, an H1 element will always have like some text inside of it to show up. That's kind of how they work. But if we look back at this particular H1 element here, you can see that the text is underneath it, meaning inside of that element is another element. Basically, there's kind of like this tree-like structure to it because we're nesting all of these pieces of data at different points and for different reasons. The idea here is this. Hopefully you can see how this little tree-like thing we're looking at is an HTML document just spread in a way that is structured in a tree, right? From the top level, there's a document. And then in that document, we get to see all of these different elements with their different attributes. This is what the document object model allows for us to do with JavaScript. It allows for us to represent any HTML document as this nested tree that we can navigate as an object of data. The reason that's important is because we can use that data to then do all types of really interesting things with JavaScript. And like the W3 School says here, right? JavaScript then gets the ability to change any of the things on that particular document that we're looking at. That's what makes it really interesting and such a vital part of our web dev journey, right? JavaScript can change all the elements in the document. It can change all the attributes of those elements. It can change the styles and the CSS of those elements. It can remove any of those things, right? You can use it to create and add new stuff to the document that isn't there already, right? JavaScript is what allows us to modify the HTML document. Now, if that makes sense to you just off that one explanation, give me a thumbs up. You know what I'm saying? I got to celebrate my own wins. You know what I'm saying? This is 6:37. I got to be like, I did that. You know what I mean? Like, but if it doesn't make sense to you, don't worry, because we're about to show some examples and hopefully it'll make sense in a second. But the idea though is this: we use JavaScript to change what's on the HTML document. That is what we use JavaScript for. And that's what makes our sites go from static sites to dynamic sites, because you might have a JavaScript function that changes what's going on your HTML document. So what you previously had on your HTML might not be there or might be added to with some JavaScript. And that's why we would call those sites using JavaScript a bit more dynamic. So just as an example, I think they have it. Where do they have it here? They got to have it somewhere here. Maybe it's at the beginning for JavaScript. Let's see. One of the cool things, I like to show this as an example, right? So here's what I mean by a dynamic nature of JavaScript, right? So let's say, for instance, we have like some HTML like this. Like this is probably just a heading that says my first JavaScript. And this is a button. It says, click me to display date and time, right? Well, that's really all we see as users on the HTML right now. But when we click this, right, now we can actually see a little date pops up, right? Now, this element wasn't previously there, but once we click that button, we were able to add that particular, maybe this is a paragraph of text that got added to our document just when that button got clicked, right? That's what I mean by saying JavaScript is able to change the HTML document and add new elements or take away elements that might not have been there previously. That makes sense. Give me a thumbs up. Sometimes you got to see it to believe it. You're like, oh, I get it now. I see what he was talking about. That's what he meant. Yeah, that's exactly what I meant, fam. That right there. And just for another example, right? I think that do they have it here? I love this other example from the W3 schools, right? Like this like kind of interactive little thing here. So we have two buttons and we have an image, and we have the ability to click this button, turn on the light, and it turns on the light. And we have this other one that turns off the light and turns off the light, right? Realistically, how is this working? Well, we're using JavaScript, one, to understand when these buttons are being clicked, but then two, we have this image of a light bulb, right? And at one point we have this empty light bulb, but then on another point we have this filled in light bulb. So realistically, to get this nice little toggle effect, all they're doing is switching which image do we see based on what button that do we click, right? So this is an example of like, well, we can use JavaScript to really make our sites interactive to this degree, right? To change the elements. And instead of changing the entire image, we're just changing the source. Like what image do I want this image that's gonna stay here to show? Is it gonna be the image with the light bulb on, or is it gonna be the image with the light bulb off, right? And what's cool about the W3 schools is for all of these examples on the introduction or in the home or in the DOM, down here in the JavaScript DOM, you can always try it yourself to take a look at some of the JavaScript that they use to make this possible. So here's just an example and a look at what we're going to start diving into a little bit ourselves, right? So this, my friends, is an HTML document, right? Give me a thumbs up. Y'all can see and agree with me. This is just an HTML document. We have a declaration, HTML tag. This is the body, right? They just don't have a head. You don't necessarily need a head if you don't have anything in there. Then inside of that body, we have a button, right? And here's the button for, it says turn on the light. And then they have another button for turn off the light. And when you see inside of this button, you see this really long, crazy looking thing right here. Document get element by ID, my image dot source, do. But realistically, if we see, this is the same, basically the same line as this is. The only difference is that the source is being switched from pick of the bulb on to pick with the bulb off, right? So without knowing too much about the JavaScript, you can infer, hopefully, hey, this button is going to just set something to pick bulb on. This is going to set the source to something pick bulb off. And us toggling those things is what gives us this little light on, light off effect. But the JavaScript, as you can see, is what's doing that, right? This little weird statement that we got in the on click or whatnot is JavaScript. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about JavaScript, both from the standpoint of like, how do we write it as a programming language to what the heck is going on in this line right here? And that's our goal today. So, so far, hopefully this making sense so far. Just give me another thumbs up. You know what I'm saying? I'll stop the share real quick so I can see all the beautiful thumbs jumping up off the screen. You know what I'm saying? Like folks saying, yeah, this makes sense. Let's go. Yeah. That's all we want to see. You know what I'm saying? We want to see positivity. I love it. Cool. If you have a question though, please feel free to drop it in the chat. Not trying to make it hard for y'all to ask any questions. So appreciate that. Appreciate that. I mean, I said you make it so easy to understand. Thank you, bro. Those are the words of affirmation I want. I want people to say that. Thank you. That's all I'm trying to do. That's all I'm trying to do. All right, cool. So now let's take it back a step and just talk about our site, right? So if you're going to follow along with me, you have your own fan club site. Just give me a thumbs up so I know how many people are following so I can pace myself correctly. If you don't have one, we'll walk through the HTML a bit so that you can see it. But we're going to really focus not on the HTML of this because we already built that. We're going to focus more on the JavaScript. So I see a lot of folks are going to follow along. Great. So let's dive into this a bit and get that going. So first things first, pull up your VS Code window with your code up, with your fan club website up. So I'll pull up mine. I'll walk through it while y'all get yours up, just for anybody that doesn't have one yet. And we will talk a little bit about what we want to add to this particular site. So the fan club website that y'all saw before, I'll share it one more time on the browser. The fan club website is this, right? It's just a pretty simple HTML site that has a couple pages, right? It was a multi-page HTML site. Each page doesn't really have too much crazy HTML going on, but we had added a lot of different things related to different elements. We added some styling. So let's just take a look at what's going on here. No matter what app you're looking at, the majority of websites are going to use a file called index.html to be like their root file. So whenever you like looking at a big website from somebody else and you're like, dang, like where do I start? 9 times out of 10, look for the index.html because that's going to be the home page of their website. And that's where you'll be able to see like, well, what else is happening here, right? So in our index.html page, we have a couple different elements, right? As you can see, I have a head, I have things like the title and my CSS in there. I'll show you that in a second. But in the body is where we get all of this very visual elements. And matter of fact, instead of showing you this on VS Code, I do want to get y'all in the habit of looking at this from the Google Chrome and your browser's developer tools. So I'm going to go back to my browser. And there's a couple ways you can go to your developer tools. You can either right click and click inspect, or you can go to view developer and then inspect elements or something like that, depending on what your browser has as an option. For me, I'm just going to go ahead, click inspect, and you're going to see that the Chrome developer tools pop up on the side here. What's cool about the Chrome developer tools is that I'm able to actually see all the elements while still looking at the website. So I don't have to keep going back and forth to VS Code. But as you can see, right, we could continue walking through some of these elements. So I have a couple different elements on this page. I have a navigation bar. I have an H1 heading. I have an image. I have a paragraph. Oops, I have this paragraph down here, another paragraph, and then this little form, right? And if I go to the about page, similarly, right, just kind of have some H1, a nav bar. I kind of push that nav bar over all of my pages, and then paragraph, right? And then inside of the head, you can see this is where I have the title for the page, as well as a link to a external style sheet. One thing that's worth noting about styles and the Chrome developer tools or Firefox or Brave developer tools, whichever ones you're using, is that in the inspector, you can get both the elements, like, right? So when I highlight over all of the body, I can see all of these elements. But as I click on these elements, all right, like let's say I click on the navigation bar, right? Well, I can see in the nav bar here, or in the H1, let's use that because there's a little bit more. I can see that this, when I highlight it, is referring to that particular block of my HTML document. But if you look down here in the like bottom half of this developer tools, you can also see the CSS that's tied to that particular element also. So now I have the H1, I can see the element, but I also can see some of the CSS. What's cool about this is you can use the Chrome developer tools to try to troubleshoot bugs with your CSS without actually manipulating your real code. Now, sometimes that's good because you're not manipulating your real code. Like it's like, oh, it's not gonna save any mistakes. But sometimes it's bad because you might spend like a whole 3 hours toggling CSS in here, but you want to save it, you got to save it on your actual in your actual file. But what I mean by that is like, let's say I'm like, hey, I'm not quite sure like what this text align is doing for the CSS. If I turn it off, right, I can see, oh, that was really what was aligning it center. So maybe I do want to keep that. Or maybe I'm like, hey, I don't actually want this to be this color. So let me maybe change it back. Or I can play around and like actually change these values right here to be different, right? So I can say, oh, like let me make that blue, right? And what I meant by the fact that it's not this doesn't save is that if I refresh this window, this is going to go back to whatever was on the HTML that I had originally. And the reason I can reload and all this, I should have mentioned, is because I'm running this on the VS Code live server. And the VS Code live server, remember, is just an extension that you can use for your static websites on VS Code in order to kind of show them in a more dynamic and show them on a server, let's say, and have it reload when you make changes and stuff like that. So yeah, so this is really all that we got going on in the code, right? Not too much is happening, but as you can see, we kind of are in a really cool place with this little bit of code right here. Like, right, we have like in my about page, I have a nice little list or description of the artist. I have this hits page. I didn't really add any hits, but you know, maybe I could say the best hits here, these last couple things. And then I have this join page where I could be like, I bet, like, let me add, let me, you know, sign up to join our little fan club or whatever, right? So how cool would it be if, you know, we could actually, you know, do something with this little form or something, right? Like we have 2 forms on this app where we are collecting email addresses, and it would be real cool if we could like actually, you know, maybe send an email or something like that with that particular information or whatnot. Um, to do that, we're not going to maybe be able to send the email immediately today, but we will be able to maybe add some interaction to start the process of validating that, hey, like this, the email that somebody is giving us is actually valid, or that, you know, they actually type something. Let's start even with that, right? Let's like, how can we make sure that at least they put something in here, right? So that's kind of what we want to do. And to do that, we're going to use a little bit of JavaScript. And in the process, we're going to learn about how to add some JavaScript to our HTML website. So again, pause just for the sake of being a good professor. If y'all rocking with me, just give me a thumbs up so I know you're following along and you're ready to go. All you need is your old code and we will knock it out together. All right. Yeah, there you go. You know what I'm saying? Come on. Come on. Let's make it happen. Yep. Yep. All righty. So let me just get myself prepared to do this with y'all, and we will make it happen. Gotta just pretend like I didn't already try to do it. All right. So here's what we're gonna do to start. First thing we gotta do is we gotta figure out how do we first of all, we gotta figure out how do we write JavaScript in our websites, right? Second of all, we gotta figure out how do we write JavaScript, period. Because like how many of y'all like this is your first time like with JavaScript? You could just raise your hand, give a thumb up, whatever, right? Like for many of us, it's probably our first time looking at this. So no worries. So, we got to figure out where do we write this, and then how we go write this to make it do something of substance for us. So that's going to be our first bet. And then we're going to go from there to hopefully adding a little bit extra layers of complexity. So it turns out, right, that we actually can write JavaScript in a number of different ways when it comes to adding it to our HTML websites. The common ways that you'll see us being able to write JavaScript are the following. The first way is by using a tag in your code that is going to allow the HTML to know that what you're writing inside of that tag is JavaScript. So what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is in your code, in any part of your HTML document, you can write some JavaScript. And to do that, you're going to use what we call a script tag, right? And a script tag is essentially like any other HTML tag. We used it to just kind of nest some data, but inside of what we nest in a script tag is JavaScript code. So you can put a script tag in any point in your HTML document, either in your head or in your body. Depending on where you put it, some aspects of what the JavaScript will do might change, but for the sake of what we're doing to learn right now, it's not going to really make too much of a difference. So what I'd like y'all to do is go ahead and inside of your head, add a new tag that's going to be called script like this. And then you can enter a couple times and you should have a space open for some text. And when you're there, just give me a thumbs up so I know that y'all are right there with me, and we'll add some JavaScript in there right now. So I'll just pause a second. I only saw one thumb come up. So, you know what I'm saying? Like folks are like, oh, he actually making us do something now. So now I gotta do something. So yeah, go ahead. Just give me a thumbs up when you got your script tag open and you have some space to write in it, and we'll make it happen. Awesome. Cool. I'm seeing some thumbs come up. So I'm trusting we're in a good place here. I see a lot in the chat. Thank y'all so much. All right. So what we did right here was we just created a script tag. And now what we did was define inside of our code a space where we can actually write some JavaScript. So you can see if we highlight over this with VS Code, it says the script element allows authors to include dynamic script and data blocks in their documents. This doesn't represent content for the user. So whether or not you put the script in your head or the body, your user's not going to see the data there. The script will just do what you tell it to do. So here's what I want y'all to do. I want y'all inside of your script tag to just write console.log, open some parentheses. This is about to look a little crazy. And inside of those parentheses, put some open quotation marks and just say, hello from the HTML file. I can say hello world. I don't know why I didn't just do hello world, but you know what I'm saying? We try to be unique. We try to be different. We try to be different out here. Talking about hello world. What? Hello Mars. If anybody knows a band called 30 Seconds to Mars, I'll mess with you. Boom. So what I want you to do, add that little console.log with, you can really write whatever you want inside of these quotation marks, and then save it. And then what you need to do in order to see this, to be like, oh my gosh, JavaScript, right? Go back to your particular website. You should have it running on the server. It's easier if you do it on the live server. Otherwise, just make sure you open your HTML document and then go to your console. And you should see whatever your message was that you typed in the console log, you should see it here in the JavaScript console. That's what it's for. The console is for that particular reason. So just to reiterate, go to your code, create a script tag inside of the script, do a console.log with any string that you want. You can put it whatever you want it to say. Make sure it's in quotes to be a string. And then save the file and then go back to your site on the live server or in your browser. And you're gonna need to inspect the elements and go to the console. So click the console in your developer tool so that you can see your console logging, your message logging here to the console. And if you can see it, just give me just raise your hand just so I could sell. Like it sticks around a little longer if y'all do that than if you thumbs up. There you go. All right, look at y'all. You know what I'm saying? Go ahead, fam. You know what I mean? Look at you. Just wrote your first JavaScript in 20 seconds. You gotta celebrate yourselves. Like, look at that. You know what I'm saying? Look at that. You know, Sarah, Alex, look at y'all. You know what I'm saying? Andrew, I see you. Christopher, I see you. Jose, I see you. Franklin, I see you. Look at you. You know what I'm saying? We doing it out here. I see some folks throwing their thumbs up. Yeah, I love it. That's it. There you go, Donovan. Good job, fam. Good job, Joseph. Good job. Good job. Yeah, you know what I'm saying? Look at y'all. JavaScript ain't nothing to y'all. You know what I mean? Look. And I see some more folks in the chat. Appreciate that as well. You can't see your console. Can't find my console. All right, let's talk about that just to make sure that folks can see it. So in order to see your console, you have to inspect the elements of your screen. So what you want to do is make sure that you at least have your code running on the server. Well, first of all, let's back up. First of all, you got to make sure you have at least this code written into your HTML file, right? Script, some console message. You want to make sure you save that so that that's clearly saved on your particular VS Code instance. And then thirdly, you want to make sure that you have the live server running. So I ran the live server here, open with live server, but you could run it a number of ways. There's a button down here that's like go live, so you could use that. Either way, once you've saved this and once you've opened this in the server, it should open your screen back up here. To get to your console, you either want to go to View, Developer, and click Console. Some browsers don't have it set that way, so just right-click, click Inspect, and then look for on the sidebar here. There's a bar called Elements. There's always a tab called Console, and make sure you click over to the console so that you can see your console's message there. Mine says blocked by third party. I kind of change that so I can see it on the console. Blocked by third party. Interesting. Not too sure about that, fam. We gotta check out that. Can you send me a Slack with the screenshot of what it's showing you so I can look it up? Blocked by third party. How can I change that? Interesting. Yo, Marco, send me a Slack with that message or a screenshot of what you're seeing so I can take a look at that for you, bro. But hopefully for everybody else, it's showing up. It shouldn't be that difficult. This ain't the hard part. This is the easy part. That's crazy. That is crazy. Sugar cookie, man. This is crazy. If you know where that's a reference from, I mess with you. All right, bet. So I'm sorry that some folks aren't seeing it, you know what I'm saying? But hopefully other folks we can get there over time. Looking at the chat real quick. So you can see JavaScript more in the back end. Good question. What you're looking at right here is the front end, right? This is the console of your HTML site, right? So what you're looking at is still front end stuff. We're looking at the JavaScript in the console. In order for us to, print, right, JavaScript doesn't really happen. By default, JavaScript runs in our internet browsers, right? Our browsers are built for us to run JavaScript. If we want to see JavaScript output and things of that nature, we have to use the console here in order to see that. The problem is that sometimes sometimes in order for us to properly output JavaScript in our applications, we're going to need to actually add some extra steps to make it so that we can run JavaScript not only in our browser, but in other places. But the majority of internet browsers are built to support JavaScript. And what happens is when you actually don't have JavaScript enabled in a browser, it will tell you, hey, you know, this site doesn't have JavaScript. So there's also some HTML you can put into your apps, into your websites, in case somebody doesn't have any JavaScript. We'll take a look at those in the future. But yeah, Marcos fam, I saw your message on the Slack. If you look at the top, you still see your code, your message from the console is printing. It's right at the top, but you're getting some those block third-party cookie things are more focused on I think just like your browser settings for blocking stuff. I don't think that's not having anything to do with you seeing the console. It's just at the top. It could be because the live server injects some code into your file, and so they're just notifying you that, hey, they blocked that little thing. So don't worry too much about it. Just take a look at the top. You see your hello from the HTML file is right there. Yeah, my boy said, huh? Yeah. So, all right, fam. So we're gonna keep it pushing. I appreciate y'all who raised your hands. Thank you so much. Hopefully everybody else got an opportunity to see it. But yeah, we just wrote our first print message in JavaScript. So let's go back and talk about it. So what we wrote right here, we created a script tag, which allowed for us to write our first line of JavaScript. That first line of JavaScript was a console log, right? And a console log, I'm going to write some more JavaScript right here. A console log is how we print messages in JavaScript. So right here, you can see I just added a comment to that particular, to inside of our JavaScript, right? To leave a comment, you can leave an inline comment just with double slashes, right? I think those forward slashes, right? So this is how we print messages in the JavaScript is a console.log, and I'll just make that clear. Console. I'll make that clear if I can spell. Whoa. Console.log equals how we print messages in JavaScript. And console.log is itself a function, right? So this one simple print message, it might not be that simple. Y'all might be like, this is the most complicated. I feel like this is an easier print message than like printing in Java. What would y'all say? Right? If this is easier than printing in Java, give me a thumbs up. Y'all would know. Y'all are the Java folks. You know, you know what I'm saying? Like system.out.println, you know what I'm saying? Console.log, hello from the HTML file, right? Well, let's break this down a little bit because this actually can teach us a lot. This one line, this is the, you know, in Codecademy, they're like, print something in JavaScript, write this thing. But there's so much happening in this one line that's important for you to know. So first thing that this is showing us is it's actually giving us our first glimpse into a JavaScript object. Remember at the beginning of all this, I was like, objects are like these pieces of data we can interact with, right? Remember I said that? Well, this is an example of an object in use, right? What we have here is a console, the console object, I should say. And the console object is a built-in object in JavaScript. It's always going to refer to an instance of the console that gets created when you create your document and everything else. There's a couple very important objects that are just kind of built into the JavaScript that we write. Funny enough, like it's like actually kind of crazy to think about it. Like, oh, well, like how does that work? I gotta nerd out a little bit more on how that works. But there's a couple of big elements, and we'll talk about two of them today. The console is one of them, right? You don't have to create anything to make the console. It just exists in JavaScript, in your JavaScript files, right? How it works is that this console is going to be tied to whatever HTML document is serving up that particular JavaScript, or if we're in certain environments that don't use that aren't using our HTML document, there's certain libraries that we can use with JavaScript to run printing console messages to our terminal. But right now, most times when you write JavaScript in an HTML file, I should say the majority of times, you're going to have that console be the console in your browser, this console right here, right? So what we're seeing here is an instance of a class called console, and we call this an object. So this is an object called console. I know that sounds confusing. I heard it, y'all. I said it and I heard it and I was like, dang, that sounds confusing. But this is an instance of a bigger class called console. We're not going to get into the class of the console or any of that. We're just going to talk about it like it's an object. So trust me when I say this got some information on what data it needed to have from somewhere else. That's what classes do, right? They structure what data an object will have. Point is, this console is itself an object. And if to show you this, I'm going to actually just type console right here, and I'm going to do dot. And VS Code is super cool because it will help you see some of the available properties and methods on particular objects, right? So by doing a dot, I can see anything in the anything here in with the like pink looking cube is a function, a method, right, for that particular object. So there's a couple of different actual methods that you can call a console object, right? So as you can see, they're kind of built in, all of these properties and methods and stuff. The method that we use was log. So we actually referred to it with a dot log, right? The dot syntax is how we actually got the property from this particular object, right? And we can reference it. What the log is, though, is it's a function. So here we're able to call a function. Now, I should have put a disclaimer. I'm like, dang, like now I'm like so late into the game. I should have made this disclaimer. This is the disclaimer like an hour into my lesson that I should have did a while ago. You might need to know a little bit about some programming for this to make sense. All these words I'm throwing out, I'm like, dang, like what if you don't know any of this? But hopefully y'all know what a function is. And really, if you don't know what a function is, the idea is a function is a piece of code that we can call to then run blocks of code. We're actually going to write some functions ourselves, so we'll see how to create a function ourselves. But what I'm trying to say here is that console.log, the .log part is a function, right? Log is a function. And the log takes in, you can see here, if I hover over it in VS Code, it says it's a method. Function, method, they're pretty synonymous here. The idea is that the log is going to take in some data, right? And it's going to, what we know it's going to do is it's going to show that data in our actual console all the way here. But how it does that, you know what I'm saying? That's for the JavaScript folks that made the console.log function to know, but for us to just use as programmers who are excited to log stuff to the console. There's probably some very sophisticated methods going on that are making it so that it's taking this string and pieces of data and then turning that into data that it's able to transfer here into the console, right? So sophisticated code going on, but the idea is this, fundamentally, and this is all I really want you to take away from this, is that we're calling our first function just by doing console.log, right? The .log part is the function, right? Log itself is the function name, and that function takes in some data, and we're passing in that data in the parentheses. That's why we have the .log with the parentheses and then something inside of the parentheses. The dot is us referencing some data from an object. The dot is a part of object syntax where any object of data, we can reference the data inside of it using the dot. So you got to know what the name of the object is that you want to, interact with. And then you can use the dot to see all of the available pieces of data that you can interact with. And then some of that data, like the log here, is able to then be used for you to handle some actual information and whatnot. So I say that to say console.log is a very important function for you to use in JavaScript. It's the function we use to print things, but it's also a great example of two very important things in JavaScript. One being calling a function, and the second being using an object and getting data off of an object. So we got the log from the console object, and we called the function that log is. Log is a function, and we were able to pass this data and do X, Y, Z. That's my little spiel. I'm sorry hopefully it didn't confuse y'all too much. If it made somewhat sense to you, give me a thumbs up. You know what I'm saying? I know there's a couple folks out there. I know somebody in the church heard me right now. You know what I'm saying? Like, I know I ain't preaching to the choir now. You know what I'm saying? Like, all right, cool. Appreciate y'all. Hey, that's good. You know what I mean? Even if you could just, if you're not 100%, but you like 75, 80% of that conversation made sense, that's good. Because you just gotta have to continue to work with these things for it to start making fuller sense. Either way, we just wrote our first bit of JavaScript. We wrote a console.log method, which is very helpful. Now let's talk about some other little bits of JavaScript that we need to know, because now we've kind of opened Pandora's box and talked about a lot of different things all at once. So right now we've created a message that we can send to the console, but there's also a lot of other things that we might want to do. So let's go back to our original purpose here. Like, let's say I want to use this JavaScript. Like, I want to write some JavaScript really for the sake of, maybe I want to validate my little contact form here. Like, I want to make sure that, hey, somebody has to type something in here for them to join our little community or whatnot, right? So how might I use JavaScript to help me do that? Let's talk about it. And in the process, we're going to introduce some other concepts about JavaScript to do that. So first things first, we're gonna step aside, because sometimes I like to teach JavaScript just like, here's how you write a variable, here's how you do this, here's how you do that, and it just kind of feels overwhelming, I feel like. So now we're gonna do it like in this practical way. So we're gonna talk about it while we do something. So let's say that I want to create the opportunity for my form, right? This little contact form down here to help me validate when somebody actually types the data into the form, right? So many of y'all probably already have a form that you put onto your site, but what we want to do is we want to make sure that we can understand, hey, when this button gets clicked, right? I want to then check something. I want to check if the person wrote something in that particular form, right? So how can we use JavaScript to do this? Well, first, what would be cool is, what if we could find out when this button is getting clicked, right? Like, what if we knew every time this button is getting clicked? That would be a great first step, right? Because if we know when the button is getting clicked, then maybe we could do something at that point. So we need to know when the button's getting clicked. Then what we also need to know is, hey, like, what is the value of the form, this little box in the form, the input in the form, right? Give me a thumbs up if that makes sense. First, we want to know, hey, when did they click the join button? And then second, we want to know, hey, what's inside of this box? Is there anything in there, right? If that makes sense, give me a thumbs up, because that's exactly what we got to do to figure this all out. So yeah, fam. So exactly. So I see a lot of thumbs coming up. That they're like, yeah, that makes sense, Cam. So talk to us. What we got to do? How are we going to make this happen? Well, to do that, we can actually use what I was talking about with the JavaScript document object model, right? There's a lot of things that the document object model is going to be helpful for us to do, particularly with things like figuring out when certain items or certain elements of our page are being interacted with, like when a click happens or when a user hovers over something, right? We can use JavaScript to detect those things. We call those events. Every website that you use nowadays, right, has event handling on it, right? Whenever you click something, there's an event. Whenever you scroll on something, that's an event, right? These types of events are triggered by certain actions that the user takes, but we can use JavaScript to listen for those changes and basically put some code out when those changes take place. We also can use a document object model, like I was talking to y'all about before, to look at what data is inside of a particular element over time. So JavaScript can help us do both of these things. So we're going to write some code. It's going to look crazy, but I swear we're going to break it down into making it make sense for all of y'all. But this way, at least you walk away with something practical for what you can use your JavaScript to do right now. So I'm going to go back to VS Code. And what I want to do is, first, I want to understand when this button is getting clicked, right? It would be cool to just know, hey, whenever this button gets clicked, maybe I want to do something, right? So how do buttons and events work within JavaScript? So every event, and we can go to here, this DOM events tab on the W3 schools for just some extra context. Every time you do an action on JavaScript, on your web page, right? JavaScript can listen and basically call some code whenever you've performed that action. So let's say you click on something, right? Well, JavaScript can detect that, and then you can use JavaScript to say, hey, add another message or something. It says, click me again. Okay, cool, right? So this particular box is responding to my clicks. This one says mouse over me. So that means hover over with the mouse. And you can see it changes to a different piece of text. If I click this, nothing really happens. But when I mouse over it, something happens, right? So the HTML DOM allows JavaScript to react to HTML elements, or HTML events, excuse me. I just got caught up on this word right here, react. Folks are like, why he wink like that? That was the ugliest wink I've ever seen. That's because that ugly wink, I'm trying to tell y'all, react. Get it? React? We'll come back to that when we start talking more about React. But the idea is that with the HTML DOM, we can actually allow JavaScript to listen and do things when we hear different events, right? Whether those are clicks, whether those are mouse overs, all these really cool things that you are going to expect people to do on your site, we can do, right? So reacting to events, a JavaScript can be executed, I guess, a JavaScript piece of code can be executed when an event occurs, like when a user clicks on an element. To execute code when a user clicks on an element, add JavaScript code to an HTML event attribute. Now, if you were reading this by yourself and you weren't following your boy Cam and doing this with me, you'd be like, what are they talking about? But we're about to show you that right now. So basically what they're saying here is that you can add JavaScript code to different events that you're listening for on different elements. There's a huge list of events. Maybe they have some of them here for you to take a look at. They got a bunch in this example of the W3 schools. On mouse down, on load, on focus. Those are some events when you do things with your mouse, right? Like stuff like that. On change is a very important one that happens when you're like changing elements in like a form or something, and inputs, like it says here in inputs. On load, on unload, right? These happen when the page is loading and stuff like that, right? There's a lot of different events. There's so many events that you might not know which events are you able to use unless you actually look up the element that you're taking that you're working with. So for instance, right now I'm working with an HTML button, right? And I love that on VS Code, right? If you hover over your elements, you can really quickly get a reference to like the Mozilla developer documentation, which is also really helpful because it has like all of the elements information in here. So one of the things about these elements are that all of those elements have different, all these elements have different events that they're able to trigger, right? And I'm pretty sure if we were to scroll down, I'm sure it should tell us this, but maybe it won't. Maybe it's gonna do me dirty and not tell us this. Well, they have this section here, clicking and focus, whether clicking on a button, blah, 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 but does it give us a list of all of the elements here? Interesting. Well, sorry, y'all. They're trying to make your life harder, but that's why you come mess with your boy Cam, because I'm about to tell you what you got to do, so you don't gotta spend hours in documentation that don't make no sense. But I'm sure if you actually read through some of these examples, they'll show you an example of pressing the button or something. But dang, that's kind of crazy. Here it's talking a little bit about it. Hey, button has no default behavior. Event handlers can be scripted to da 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 da. They're talking a lot, but they didn't give you any insight there. We can see actually the W3 schools did give us a better example. So one of the events, and this is an event that you can use not only on buttons, you can use this on any element, is the on-click event, right? So these different events, some elements have specific ones you can call, but some are just kind of, you can use across all of the elements, right? One of those events is the on-click, right? And the on-click is the way that you can basically tell an element, hey, when you detect a click happen, run this or do this, right? And in this, as you can see from this little example, we're going to be able to say, hey, when the click is detected, I want to call some JavaScript, right? So let's try that out just ourselves and use what we know so far, which is we know a little bit about console logs. So let's go ahead and inside of our button, I'm going to go ahead and just create an on click. Sorry, that is a habit because I'm used to writing React and not regular JavaScript. But in regular JavaScript, it's lowercase, all lowercase on click. And inside of quotation marks, you're going to actually call the function you want to run when the click happens. So in this case, I want the console.log and I want a console log clicked, right? Notice one thing is that we have to surround the JavaScript with quotes, with quotation marks. So in order for this quotation mark to not break, I had to surround the text for clicked with a single quote. So remember in JavaScript, you can use single quotes or double quotes as to detect strings, but sometimes you have to use one because you're using another one. So here, because I'm using these double quotes, I have to use single quotes here. So we're gonna go ahead, just do that. So I'm gonna write on click, and then I add the console log for clicked, right? Then I'm gonna go back to my console here and go back to my little application running right here. And I'm just gonna go ahead and click the join button. And as you can see real fast, for like 2 seconds, you can see that little click happen. And then the page reloads. The page reloads because this button is a part of a form. So by default, a form will reload the page after it's submitted. One way we can make it real fast to not do that is actually to just get rid of the type submit here for the button for a second, so that all we see is button, on click, clicked, etc. That way, when we actually click this button, oh, it's still gonna do it. My bad, fam. I'm sorry. We got to tell the form not to reload. That's a whole different thing, but I don't want to get y'all too caught up in that all right now. But for now, you can see it. It is actually logging, but it just reloads the page real fast. I'll go ahead and put this type submit back in here just because it's helpful. But as you can see, we're actually calling some JavaScript in this function already, right? So what's cool is we are already now able to pass an event, listen for the click, and when the click takes place, we're able to then perform some JavaScript. So hopefully y'all were able to do this and you can see something on your console. Just give me a thumbs up if you could. Sorry that it reloads so fast and makes it so it's like, dang, like wanna bask in it. you wanna see that forever, you know what I'm saying? But it just goes away too quick. Thank y'all so much. Appreciate that. So great, you saw it, right? We saw that we could click this and we actually saw things take place. Now let's continue the conversation though and say, okay, so now I'm detecting when this button is getting clicked. And if you don't believe me that, you can add an on click onto anything, I'm going to go ahead and inside of this H1, just for the sake of it, I'm going to add the on click in here too. I'm going to console log, click the heading, right? I'm going to save that. And so here, because this isn't a form, it should stick around in the console a little bit longer. So as you can see, I clicked the heading and now I can get this thing called click the heading, right? So this is a really cool way for you to add like interactivity things to your web page by way of just, having events take place. Some folks might call that an Easter egg. Like you might not know, hey, you might not know you can click this, but when you click it, you can make something happen, right? So now let's talk about the types of things we can actually have happen in this particular moment. So remember, with the JavaScript DOM, right, we're actually able to do a lot. Like I said, we can change elements, we can add new elements, we can remove elements, and we can change the existing kind of attributes in an element, right? JavaScript can do so much for us whenever we want to. In order to talk a little bit more about that, I want to continue this example of what we want to accomplish with our button here, right? We want that button to not only detect when a click takes place, we also want to know, well, when the click takes place, what is the value of our form's input, right? Like what is inside of that form input at that period of time, right? So theoretically, what I'd love to do is essentially when this click takes place, I don't just want a console log and have something just say clicked. I'd love to know what actually is inside of this form's input. So what I want to do is use JavaScript to essentially traverse this document, find my form, right? And within my form, I want to take the value of this particular input and get the data for that particular input, right? So there's a couple ways you could do this, and that's what's crazy about JavaScript. There's a lot of different ways you could do certain things. So I'm gonna try to take a stab at doing it one way, and then that way, because I just can introduce you to a method that's a little bit simpler, and then we can go from there. So here's what I want to do. First thing I'm gonna do is inside of my input, I want to give it an ID. I want it to have like a unique identifier that I can use to say, hey, this is my home page form or something, right? So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to give this an ID, right? And remember, an ID is an attribute that you can give to any element so long as there's only one element with that ID on your document, right? You can have another page with a similar ID, but for now, the idea is that no matter what element you're looking at in this one document, that ID is going to be unique. So here, I'm going to give this a pretty unique identifier. I'm going to just say contact input, right? And contact dash input is just my unique ID for this input, right? So with this ID, what it allows, when you give an element an ID, you give yourself the ability to find that element with its ID, which is very helpful when you're using JavaScript for programmatic stuff, as well as like we talked about with CSS, right? Where you can target specific elements with their ID using this hashtag sign, pound sign, right? ID equals whatever, right? So IDs and classes are very helpful for targeting groups of elements. The ID allows you to target a specific element, but the class attribute allows you to target a bigger group of elements with the same identifier, I should say. So first thing I did was I added an ID to this input. And now I want to basically rewrite, instead of using just this regular console log, I want to create a function. And I want that function to be able to help me find this data, be able to find this data from the input at that period of time. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to actually create a function. So at the top where we actually created our script tag, I'm going to use that as an opportunity to create a new JavaScript function. So now we're going to talk a little bit about functions. And in doing this function, we're going to see a couple of little pieces of JavaScript. So I'm going to write this function the traditional way first, and then maybe in a subsequent class, definitely in a subsequent class, we're going to talk about how to modify those functions to be a little bit more relevant to how we write them nowadays. But I'm going to go ahead and create a function. And I'm going to do it this way just so you can be in your head, this is a function, right? So I'm going to create a function, and creating functions in JavaScript, like I mentioned, there's two ways. This way is the older way where you use the function keyword, but there's a newer way of writing functions that we'll talk about later. But I just want to create a function that's going to be called validate form. And this function is going to take some code and basically return some code whenever it gets called. So the function keyword allows you to declare something as a function. You just need to put parentheses and open some curly braces to then define what's going to happen in that function whenever it gets called. So at this point, right, I'm going to say, well, the first thing I want to do is I want to get the value of the input of the form input, right? So that's the first thing I want to do. So I'm going to show you how we can do this, and then we could talk a little bit about what this crazy function is going to be is doing. So let's say I'm going to say let value, or let's say let input value and set it equal to, I'm just going to write it for now, and then we're going to talk a little bit about what this big crazy looking thing is going to do. Document get element by ID, and then inside of this, I'm going to pass a string, and I'm going to say contact dash input, and I'm going to let that be, right? Then I want to say, so I'm going to pause right there just to let us see what's going to happen here, right? So let input value get document dot get element by ID contact input, right? Hopefully this, if you read this, you're like, this kind of makes sense what it's doing, right? Give me a thumbs up if you think you know what this is doing, right? Document get element by ID contact input, right? You maybe just by reading that, you're like, I kind of get what that's doing, right? Realistically, what this piece of code is doing is it's looking through our HTML document, right? And it's going to get an element by ID. Remember, elements are what's inside of our HTML already. Get an element by ID, like I was mentioning, is us looking for an element by way of an ID. And here I passed in contact dash input as the ID. So what we're doing down here is, remember, I created an input with an ID of contact dash input, right? So what is this line of code going to do for us? Well, it's going to select and get back this element. That's what the hope is. The hope is that when this code runs, this is going to go through our HTML document and get that element that we just targeted with that particular ID. Now, remember I mentioned that there were two objects that we were going to make use of in our code today that I wanted to introduce you to. The first was the console, which had a bunch of properties and which had a bunch of methods in there, like log, which allowed us to write this message to the console. But there's also now the document. Now, document is also a built-in object in JavaScript that will allow you to reference whatever JavaScript whatever HTML document your JavaScript is being called from. So in my case, right, remember this document, this HTML document here is being called within this script. This JavaScript is being called within this existing HTML document that we already wrote for our fan club, right? Inside of that, I have the script, and that's where we're writing this JavaScript. What JavaScript can do is you can use the document object to reference that HTML document that is calling your JavaScript that it's linked and connected to. So this document is going to refer to this entire HTML document that's here, right? Get element by ID is going to search for an element that has the particular ID that we pass in. So let's just see for right now what happens when we console log input value to the console. So again, the console log is a very important function because you can use it to print stuff, like, of course, but printing stuff is really a good way for you to test what's happening inside of your code. So I'm going to create this function. I'm setting a variable here. So this line 12, the let keyword is how you declare a new variable in JavaScript. And unlike Java, where your variables have to have specific data types, right? Here in JavaScript, because naturally all data is of an object, you can create a variable without declaring an implicit type. This is one of the things that is very fundamentally different about JavaScript than like a language like Java, for instance. But there are also new iterations of JavaScript that actually add back in strong types, which is stuff like TypeScript, if you've ever heard of that. But by default, JavaScript you don't need to give your variables types, right? And so here, I'm just saying, hey, I'm creating a new variable. It's going to be called input value. I'm setting that variable equal to whatever this returns. So remember, this is going to the document. The dot, remember with the dot is like any object has a set of properties as well as functions, right? The blue rectangular things here are properties. The pink purplish like cubes are functions, right? So you got methods and you got properties. functions and properties, right? However you want to call it. But everything in the purple square is like a function that's pre-built into this document. Remember, the document is coming from the document object model. It's already predefined. You don't have to define it. But as you can see, there are a lot that you can do with the HTML document within JavaScript. And this goes back to what we were talking about before. What we used was the get element by ID, which is itself a function, a method that we can call with a particular string to get back an HTML element. So now what we're going to do is we call this, we're going to save this and just take a look at our console log. But the last step I want to do in order for this console log there to run is instead of calling in my onClick this clicked with the console log, I'm going to call validate form. Right? So I'm just going to switch what the function is that I'm calling down here, save this, and just for y'all to see, right? So I got validate form, and I just kind of called it here down there. And so I go back to my code here, and when I click join, oh man, I forgot that. I forgot that it's drawn as reload so fast that we can't see it. Dang, that's crazy. That is funny. That is funny. All right, this is not what I want to do, but I'm gonna do it here I'm gonna do it in the H1 just because I want y'all to see what comes back. I wouldn't put this here. This is just me doing this so we could see it real fast. I could stop the form from reloading, but the code for that looks a little funky, and I don't want to make it the focus right now. So I just added that same function, validate form. Remember, I had put a click on the H1 up here. I could, one thing I could do, I'm not gonna think too much about it because we're right at time. Anyway, I put this here just so that we can click it and see what happens, right? So when we click that, when that button gets clicked or when this H1 gets clicked, whatever, right? We can see that this is actually returning an element for us, right? This entire element, when you hover over it on the console, is going to show you what element is this connected to on the page, right? So get element by ID returns an element. This element is right now is this input. So we're actually getting this input back, which is great. But what we're doing here is, okay, we're getting this input back, but what I want to know is what's inside of the input, right? And the input itself, this is just something to know about forms and inputs. The input itself has the ability for us to get its value, to know what the value is of that input. To do that, all I want to do is say, hey, document get element by ID. That's going to give me this entire input itself. But if I want to get the value of the data inside of the input, I just have to pass dot value. And that should give me the value of the input at that particular moment in time. So I'm going to go back here. I'm going to click this, and we can see it's empty, right? Now, if I go ahead and say cam at blah, blah.com, right? And then I type this again, right? You can see cam at blah, blah.com, right? The only reason I'm clicking up here again, remember, is just because when we click this, it reloads so fast. But you can see it just right there, right? Cam at blah.com, right? Join, woo, it was there. Sorry it reloads so quick, but that's just the nature of how it goes. So what we're gonna do now, I just wanna add one more line to this to just make sure that I can validate that there's something there. Now, this will be the last piece of code I write so that we can end on time. But now I'm going to just write a conditional. I'm going to say if input value is equals the empty string, right? Meaning that there's nothing in there. I'm going to have some conditional. So I'm going to say, and this, I'm going to introduce y'all to another really helpful function in JavaScript. It's another object in JavaScript that you can use is the alert. An alert is a function, it's a built-in function in JavaScript that you can use to pop up a message. So in this alert, you just pass a string. So I'm going to say, you need to fill out your email, right? Else, if it's not empty, right, I'm going to just return, right? I could just say return true or something. So functions in JavaScript have the ability to return any value that you want them to return. You don't have to specify before you write the function whether it's going to return something or not. By default, all functions in JavaScript return void, so you don't have to give it anything specific to return. But in this case, I did give it something to return just for the sake of what I want to have happen here. Maybe instead of returning true, I could say alert, thanks for signing up, plus input value. And that way I can make a nice little string that's like, thanks for signing up, blah, 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 right? And so now in my validate form, right, in the button being called, let's try it out now. So I'm gonna say cam@blah.com. I'm gonna join, and you can see now I get this dope little pop-up. Thanks for signing up, cam@blah.com, right? And you can see because the alert kind of pauses the JavaScript execution, we can see that you can see in the chat, in the console, that that message that we had there. Once I press OK, it's going to reload, but that's good for now, right? So now I don't have to use this random Easter egg click to make it happen, right? But I could still use it the way I expected. So if I actually now leave it blank, click join, hey, you need to fill out your email. Oh, okay, cool, right? But now cam@blah.com, join, hey, thanks for signing up, right? So what are we doing here, right? Just to recap in class on something that hopefully makes sense. We're using JavaScript to make our application a little bit more dynamic, right? We're able to change things now and have the JavaScript react to events taking place on our JavaScript in our HTML. How we did that was we used the JavaScript tags, the script element, in order to create a space for us to write some JavaScript. First, we did it to just write simple console log. Then we use it to create a function, right? And this function is a piece of code that we can refer to later in our HTML document or later in our JavaScript. This particular function is called validate form, and inside is doing some interesting stuff. The first thing is doing is getting the value of the form input. And we use a document object model function, a built-in function in JavaScript called document get element by ID, which allows us to use JavaScript to find any element that we have in our document with a particular ID. There's also other document object model functions like get element by class names or get find element by element name or stuff like that. There's a lot of different methods you can use for JavaScript to find elements. Once we found it, we used the dot value to get that particular element's value, and we saved it in a variable. So here's us using JavaScript to create a variable, right? Then again, we use the console.log, which is to print. But instead of printing a string this time, we actually printed the data. It's because this data was an element, right? Because this data was an element, we were able to see the element in real time, right? But we actually now have a piece of data, so we're able to print that piece of data. And now we just did a really simple if-else condition, right? Most of y'all are probably familiar with if-else statements in your previous programming language. But here we just compared, said, hey, if the value of whatever this piece of data is equal to an empty string, which means nobody typed anything, then we have one alert. Otherwise, we have a different alert, right? And that's kind of how we got this working. What I did here was just create a string that was a concatenated string. So it was like basically like 3 strings added together to just create a little message as a string for this alert that has thanks for signing up, a little space, the name from the value from the field, and then exclamation mark. So here we're doing some really practical stuff with the JavaScript, but hopefully you can see a couple of really important things that you're going to need to know, right? You're going to need to know how to write functions. We're going to need to know how to set variables. We're definitely going to need to learn how to call functions and call data from specific objects that are already created. We haven't created our own objects, but we'll see those in a second. And console logs are really helpful for just testing what we're doing. Conditionals are always going to be important because you're going to want to compare something to something else and do something in one case or do something else in another case, right? And it only grows from there. You can use arrays to store multiple lists of data, right? And you can use JavaScript in so many other ways to detect other changes being made in your web pages. But that's it, fam. I don't like going too long because I really want to keep this for y'all. I'll share this index.html file with y'all so y'all can take a look and play around with for yourselves. But hopefully you got something out of today's lesson. Give me a thumbs up. Give me some love if you did. Hopefully it wasn't too confusing. You got some practical JavaScript in you, and now you can mess around and do some stuff with your own contact form to add some stuff there. If you want a challenge and you're like, what can I do next? I would say look into regex or look into how can you validate that that was an actual email, and you can use regex to do something like that, amongst other things. So appreciate y'all, good people. Please take care. Take a look at the Slack for any updates. And if you have a question, feel free to stick around. Otherwise, I will see y'all in a couple of days. Peace, 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 peace.